Without further ado, I'd like to ask Professor Joachim Krause from Ruhr Bochum University, who will be speaking on the integrity of the legal system and the fate of the nation, a lesson from the book of Amos.
Well, thank you very much for the kind introduction and for the invitation to speak in this conference, which is a timely conference, I think. The integrity of the legal system and the fate of the nation, a lesson from the book of Amos. Hear this word, which I take up over you, lamentation, O house of Israel. This is the provocative opening of the composition, which is found in the very center of the book of Amos. In the literary world conceived by the book, a prophet appears and begins to speak. We see him confronting an assembly, in fact, the largest possible assembly, that of the entire nation. So, House of Israel, Beit Yisrael, refers to the northern kingdom here. The scene unfolded before our mind's eyes is probably to be located in the capital Samaria or else at the national shrine in Bethel. Either way, the entire nation is being addressed, although one should assume that the addressees are not able to listen anymore. The word they are admonished to heed and hear is a lamentation, kin'ah, which is to say that the Israelites are witnessing their own funeral song. The prophet resorts to a most drastic means of rhetorics. He addresses living people as if they were already dead. The composition opens with a lamentation and it closes on this same motif. This observation is a first clue to unlocking the structure of this artfully crafted piece of prophetic literature. Like the entire collection of sayings attributed to a prophet called Amos in chapters 3 to 6, our passage as well displays a concentric structure, as you see on the slide. And from this structure, it is readily observed that the imagined assembly is not provoked without reason. Rather, the prophet seizes the attention raised by this rhetoric's means to pronounce an admonition. Seek me that you may live. In the parallel instance, this is varied as follows. Seek good and hate evil that you may live. Hate evil and love good and establish justice in the gate. Perhaps Yahweh Sebaot will be gracious to the remnant of Joseph. While the jarring intonation of a funeral song seems to suggest that it is too late for that already, the addressees are forcefully called to change their ways. However, this should not be construed as contradictory, as I already intimated in the term provocation. Even more controversial among scholars is the identification of the actual historical situation in which such an ultimate warning would have made sense. To my mind, we should think of the last decade of the Northern Kingdom after the first Assyrian invasion, which took place in 733 BCE, and which carried with it a reduction to a severely truncated rump state in the Ephraimite hill country. So this would be already in the back of our composition, I submit. But it was before the second and fatal blow, 722, when the Assyrians basically put an end to the northern state. This dating is indicated, among other things, by the conspicuous designation remnant of Joseph, which perfectly fits said rump state while defying other explanations. In light of this, let us now turn to the searing social criticism, which forms the core of our composition. Here we encounter yet another assembly, not the imagined assembly of the entire body politic, but the assembly in the gate, that is, the actual gatherings of citizens of a given town anywhere in the country, and we will be looking at the text in a moment. The singular "the gate" serves a distributive function here. It does not refer to the gate of one specific, but to that of any town. The gate is the place in which the citizens convene in order to settle common affairs. And the importance of these assemblies, according to the composition, can hardly be overestimated. For what they do or do not do is the reason for weal and woe, life and death. Bear in mind the second admonition and its reification. Hate evil and love good, and establish justice in the gate. Perhaps Yahweh Sebaot will be gracious to the remnant of Joseph. In view of this, Göran Eidewall rightly states, it is worth noting that, according to our passage, the divine anger that brought about the downfall of the Northern Kingdom was mainly provoked by widespread corruption in the courts and systematic oppression of the poor, not by idolatry or any other cultic or religious offenses. And, we may add, the perpetrators are not to be thought among the urban elite in the capital of Samaria alone, as one might surmise from the oracles preceding and following our composition. Even less as the accusation aiming at the national apparatus of power. Rather, what is in view is the communal life all over the country, more precisely its political organization. So, what is the character and what are the functions of the assembly in the gate? The city gate, as is well known, was the place of meeting. It was a civic forum in Iron Age Levantine towns. In want of big enough spaces within the town itself, public life took place mainly in the gate, including the squares adjacent both in and outside the city wall. Therefore, in addition to the basic functions of admission control and defense, that's what a gate should serve to do, the gate served various vital functions for the local community, as is obvious from archaeological evidence as well as from the Hebrew Bible. According to the latter, trade and commerce were conducted in or at the gate. Prophets and even kings used this place for public addresses. And last but certainly not least, the gate served as meeting place for the assembly of citizens, consisting of the male, adult, self-dependent, autochthone population. This assembly served for all practical purposes as the court of law. As far as literary evidence is concerned, communal jurisdiction was in fact the most prominent social function located at the gate. In Amos 5, this is particularly clear, but a plethora of parallels could be added. If we were to sift that evidence piece by piece, it would become apparent that, while the assembly in the gate was the court of law, we should not conceptually limit this function to legal matters in our more narrowly defined sense. Looking for a more appropriate modern term, one could subsume the responsibilities of the assembly as court under communal administration. Affairs that affected the entire community were discussed and settled. Against the background of this general overview, let us now focus on one important and, despite its brevity, particularly insightful piece of evidence, namely the accusation found in the center of the book of Amos, the verses 5-7 and 10-12. For this prophetic word of the 8th century BCE bears a lesson to be learned for today about the vital importance of an integer legal system and the dire consequences that may ensue when it is violated. The accusation begins by pointing at the perpetrators in verse 7. They who turn justice, mishpat, to wormwood and have hurled righteousness, tzedakah, to the ground. In the third person plural, the accusation's subject matter is addressed systematic corruption of the legal system. This summary statement is detailed in the sequel found in verse 10. They hate the one who reproves in the gate, and the one who speaks truth, the one who speaks the truth they abhor. Here we get an idea of how justice was in fact overturned. In the gate, the place to seek and find justice, there is opposition and sheer enmity against those who try to do so. By way of contrast, this depiction shows how a member of the assembly should act. He should speak truthfully. That is, give testimony according to the facts, not considering particular interests in the matter. In the verse, this is in parallel to Yachach in the Hifil, which carries the basic meaning, decide what is right. With regard to the assembly in the gate, and in parallel to the likewise rather comprehensive idiom dover tamim, it should probably be taken to describe the conduct to be expected of any and all members of the assembly, which, however, has become the reason for outright hatred against those who cling to it. The following verse 11 touches on responsibilities of the assembly which go beyond legal matters in the narrow sense. I therefore postpone it for a moment in order to complete the picture we have just gained in verses 7 and 10, for this is what the second half of verse 12 does. There we read, "They are hostile to the righteous, take a bribe, and push aside the needy in the gate." The latter part of the parallelism makes apparent that to what end the judicial system is being corrupted. Those who are particularly dependent on justice being administered are being pushed aside. The former part gives us an idea of the means employed for that end. This is especially true of the allegation of bribery. Here, it is instructive to see that the focus is on taking, not giving bribes, for it bolsters the assumption that within the assembly of citizens in the gate, there was no functional differentiation. The assembly was the court of law, but as far as we can see, there were no permanent offices like judge, prosecutor, defense attorney, and the like. So this has to do with the responsibility of each and any citizens, and that speaks to what we have heard already. Finally, after a long and detailed discussion concerning the perpetrators, the last word of our passage shifts the focus to the victims, which makes them stand out prominently. They are called evyonim, poor, needy ones. Like dal, lowly, used in verse 11, we know this designation from later Persian period traditions in the Hebrew Bible, especially certain psalms. And there it is indicative of a certain piety specific to a particular social stratum, that of an utterly impoverished underclass. However, in Amos 5, there is not even the slightest hint at this later semantic development. As we will see in a moment, according to verse 11, the Dal can be outsmarted in the allocation of taxes, which he is apparently able to pay. Similar observations apply to the use of Evyon in other places in Amos. As regards the status of the Evyon in the assembly in the gate, the evidence suggests that he is a member of that assembly just as much as his adversaries. Clearly, the latter have a greater say in the gate, and we are probably not mistaken in assuming that the reason for this is their economic preponderance. Nevertheless, since he can be marginalized in the assembly, the Evyon seems to be a member as well. This assumption is strengthened when taking note of who is not mentioned among those who are disadvantaged by the systematic corruption of the legal system. There are no strangers or resident aliens mentioned, no day laborers or farmhands, let alone the proverbial personae miserae like widows and orphans. To put it in positive terms, the victims of corruption referred to in Amos 5 seem to be small farmers who are not as well-to-do as others, but as of yet are self-dependent members of the assembly. This leaves us with verse 11, which, as mentioned above, transcends strictly legal matters. Here, the assembly of citizens becomes apparent as key institution of communal self-administration. The verse allows for the assumption that in the assembly, taxes to be procured by the city as a whole were distributed among the citizens. The verse reads, "Therefore, because you raise tribute from the lowly and take from him levies of grain, you have built houses of hewn stone, but you shall not live in them. You have planted pleasant vineyards, but you shall not drink their wine." Here, the adversaries of the marginalized small farmers are addressed directly. From this address, we learn that they are exceptionally well-to-do. The futility curse, which is pronounced in reaction to their deeds, has them living in palace-like houses built from ashlar. As in the surrounding verses, the accusation points out the abuses of the dal by these members of the establishment. Here, however, these abuses concern some sort of levies or taxes about which we unfortunately know less than one would wish for. The first part of the parallelism, in particular the verb boshas-chem, is incomprehensible as it stands. Luckily then, the second part of the parallelism is clear and comprehensible, and it conveys the impression of an agrarian tax of some kind. Based on this evidence and the overall context as analyzed above, the following socio-economic constellation has been proposed. State taxes collected by the monarchy were claimed from cities and hinterland communities wholesale, that is, as an aggregate amount. It was then left to the local community to allocate this tax burden among their households, which, given the function of the citizens' assembly in the gate, as pointed out above, would be discussed and decided by the citizens themselves. Essentially democratic in and of itself, this procedure would have allowed for some to be more equal than others. Those already powerful economically, who in all likelihood had already become creditors to less well-to-do members of the community, would naturally have a greater say, whether or not the allocation of taxes would be fair and according to which standards was in their hands. Notwithstanding several details that must remain conjectures, overall the evidence to be gained in our verses is sufficiently transparent, and it conveys a clear picture of the responsibilities and key importance of the citizens' assembly convening in the gate. In the following, I would like to profile that picture by introducing, if only briefly, some critical distinctions which are called for by the foregoing analysis. Firstly, there is the literary critical question whether verses 10 to 12 should be taken to have been conceived of as an original literary unit, or whether that unit has been composed from heterogeneous material. I would argue for the latter, as you have already might have already sensed in my separate discussion of verses 10 and 12b on the one hand and verse 11 on the other. From the various reasons to be adduced for this analysis, let me point out that verse 11 covers a subject matter, the allocation of taxes, that is related to that of verses 10 to 12, the legal system, but it is an issue by itself. And what is even more important in my view is that the discussion of this issue is also formally self-dependent insofar as it contains an accusation and an announcement of doom following hard on the heels. Therefore, I think just like the entire composition of verses 1 to 17 is a well-conceived composition, so also verses 10 to 12 are composed from heterogeneous material. This literary critical issue is one aspect of a larger conceptual question concerning the so-called social criticism in the Book of Amos, namely the question of how accusations concerning economic abuses and accusations concerning the systematic corruption of the legal system are related to one another. This question has been raised by the German scholar Jörg Jeremias, and it has been answered by him influentially as follows. Social criticism in the narrow sense regarding economic abuses aims at various practices which are mentioned summarily. In each instance, such criticism is directly followed by an announcement of doom. According to Jeremias, this would be the message of the historical Amos. By contrast, the corruption of the legal system as criticized in chapter 5 is being introduced as one single but most fundamental misdeed. Characteristically, this latter criticism comes with a frail notion of hope, as it is followed by the divine perhaps of the admonition. Hate evil and love good and establish justice in the gate. Perhaps Yahweh Sebaot will be gracious to the remnant of Joseph. The substance of this criticism derives from the prophet as well, but the systematic elaboration of that subject matter, as found in our composition, and especially the pragmatics pointing out a way to possibly avert the imminent doom, are the innovation of those early traders who for the first time composed an actual Book of Amos. This is what Jeremias argues. In my view, the observation that criticizing systematic corruption of the legal system has been systematically developed to become a core theme of the Book of Amos is an important observation. Noteworthy for our purposes today, this observation brings out the crucial importance of the integrity of courts of law, constituted by the assemblies in the gates. And it brings out the role of the citizens' self-administration in general. Not the king, nor the national apparatus of power, nor urban elites alone. At the end of the day, the legal system and its maintenance by each and any citizen is the decisive factor for the fate of the nation. However, when heuristically distinguishing corruption of the legal system from economic abuses, it should not pass from view that they are wedded to one another. To quote again Göran Eidewall, there is a link between legal corruption and the economic interests of certain influential groups. As also observed by Jeremias, the law is not being bent for the sake of it, but because the abuses of the addressees are being accused, the abuses the addressees are being accused of would not be possible in the first place if justice was administered faithfully in the courts. The criticism of corruption of the legal system does therefore in essence contain social criticism as narrowly defined. Now, you might wonder about the reasons for devoting considerable space to a seemingly self-evident matter. The reason for this is an analysis by the German scholar Christoph Lewin, in which he eclectically adopts the basic distinction introduced by Jeremias, albeit for a different argument. From the textual evidence as analyzed above, only verse 7, with verse 10 as an early Fortschreibung, is reckoned by Lewin to be part of the base layer of the composition. Everything else is supposed to have been added at a much later stage of literary development. In fact, the original Amos tradition did not contain social criticism at all, Lewin argues, but it only contained accusations concerning the corruption of the legal system. The socio-critical cast so characteristic of the Book of Amos as we know it would have been introduced only in the second half of the Persian period, namely by circles that developed a certain piety of the poor as mentioned above. However, as we have seen, in Amos, the depiction of the victims of social abuses does not fall in line with the picture to be gained from certain psalms, that picture of an utterly impoverished underclass. Rather, the dull, as he appears in Amos, is somebody from whom taxes can be enforced, the avion is a regular member of the citizens' assembly in the gate, etc. To put my point bluntly, the evidence in Amos testifies to tangible social issues of the 8th century, not to a religious development of the 5th and 4th centuries BCE. This brings me to my conclusion. In view of our limited time, I will not bother you with a lengthy summary of the above analysis. In view of the very tangible, in fact pressing concerns that have provoked today's conference, I will instead point out just one lesson to be learned from this analysis. According to the Book of Amos, the integrity of the legal system is the decisive factor for the fate of the nation. With justice administered in the courts of every city, that nation stands. Without justice, it will fall. The Northern Kingdom fell in 722 BCE. If we had a prophet with us here today, he or she would likely use this as an example for issues which are not quite as neatly to be stored away in a distant past. It is all about the fate of the nation. Thank you very much.